Hey guys, it's the Conic, and in this one we're going to be showcasing and talking about my Herald of Agony Herald Witch build. We'll be going over the important changes that came from my extensive testing of the leveling and all budgets of the build, as well as the new mid-budget PoB that helps bridge the gap between the low and high budget. As playing through, I realized that the gap was quite large. I'll also give my opinion on how much I enjoyed each version and the overall pros and cons of the build that I noticed playing through. Starting off, let's talk a bit about the leveling, then we're going to go to the low budget. So for the leveling, it was previously untested, but now I have actually played with the leveling in mind, and I have fine-tuned it to where it is now a pretty comfortable league starter. Now granted, I don't think there's anybody that's going to be league starting at this point, but just in case, I went through to ensure that it felt as good as it could be. Now, there have been a few changes I have made. For one, we no longer use Cyclone on the low budget and the leveling section. So now when we swap over to Herald of Agony, we are now just going to be using an Arcanist brand setup with at a minimum Firestorm of Pelting. Or if you don't have currency for the T-Gem, you just go for baseline Firestorm. But the idea here is now you have an Arcanist brand setup that is helping you stack your virulence, and you want to have as many of these different like brands attached to just keep giving you a very healthy amount of virulence. Now for single targets, you can realistically only have like 2 Arcanist brands attached, but that in my experience has been enough when they are less mobile bosses or just bigger bosses. But when you have to deal with like a rare that is a very mobile species, like let's say the T4 Yellow Harvest monster as an example, Arcanist brand really starts to struggle there, because Firestorm cast on a location, it would stack virulence very well, but once they start moving, it now has to cast like new Firestorms and start the whole process again. So the more it moves, the less efficient it gets at stacking virulence. So just keep this in mind. The Firestorm variant has some pros, or the Cyclone variant rather has some pros, but the Arcanist brand is just more comfortable overall, and it allows you to stay at a safer distance as well. There is a third option that will, in the low budget, that will get you less overall DPS but a lot more comfortable playstyle, and that is using a sword coupled with a couple of mods, which I will be including in the low budget, and then using that alongside a Lancing Steel of Spraying to then proc life gain on hit, which would give you a very healthy amount of life every second before we have the Watcher's Eye, as well as practically max virulence. It's just the only downside with the sword variant is that it's a bit on the more expensive side to get going, because you would want to have it can be evaded, so you don't have to go for a resolute technique on the tree. So you need that. You will need some attack speed, and you probably want a sword, and that means you can't go for like a +3 dagger, which would be a lot of DPS for Herald of Agony. So overall, it has like a lower ceiling in terms of DPS, but it is a lot more comfortable on a budget. So I will include both versions, and you can play around or just choose the one you want on the low budget at least. If you haven't already, do consider liking and subscribing, as it helps a lot with the algorithm and with hitting our 2025 goal of getting to 2,000 subscribers. A goal that if we hit, I will be revealing my face on stream and on YouTube afterwards. So if that interests you, do consider subscribing. Now there's a change here that is very important on the low budget, and I think we also maintain the change on the medium budget. And this change feels very good to have, but actually does reduce our DPS. The way this works is we are opting for a source of permanent minion defensive layer that would make it so we do not lose our permanent minion. So in this case, that would be our specters. It makes it so it feels more comfortable, and you do not have to refresh or revive your specters when they die, because they just don't die. And we are doing this by using a minion recover life on minion death. So with this mastery, when any minion dies, and in this case we're going to have minions dying very frequently, all your permanent minions or all your minions are going to be recovering life. And how we're doing that is we are opting to replace one of Herald of Agony's 6 link. Now this you can decide to go, if you're a 5 link you can still go with, but I would recommend getting this on your 6th link. But we are using Summon Phantasm, and the reason we're going for Summon Phantasm is when our Agony Crawler hits a rare unique enemy or kills a non-rare unique enemy, it is going to summon a phantasm. When you get to the maximum number of phantasms, when a new one is to be spawned, the last one basically gets replaced, or in this case, it counts as a death. So by just clearing the map and just playing the way you normally would, you just have summon phantasms constantly dying, and as such feeding life into your permanent minions to really help with that survivability. So don't sleep on this mastery. It is very important for keeping your minions alive early on. Later on, we have more defensive layers and our permanent minions have more regen and stuff like that, but starting out, this is very important for quality of life and just for keeping your permanent minions alive. Now for a quick summary of what the medium budget is and how it functions, it's very much like the high budget, except we do not go for all the expensive items, but instead we just nudge the investment in the direction of the high budget, but we don't quite go for them all. As an example, in this budget, we are going to be trying to get our balance of terror, just so we have access to wither for single targets. Once you have your balance of terror, single target wither becomes permanently stacked basically. We're also opting to get the life gain on hit Watcher's Eye in this step, which could be an expensive one, but if you can afford to get PDR and life gain on hit, just prioritize the life gain on hit, because I really think the quality of life it provides is worth more than the defensive layers that the PDR provides. Other than these two, when switching to a Dark Seer, everything else pretty much very similar. We're opting for Dialas at this point, nothing fancy. Dialas are quite cheap now. Coloring is also very straightforward. One thing to note, however, is because we are opting for a Dark Seer, this is not really viable with Lancing Steel or Spraying anymore. Now you can still maybe make it work with Lancing Steel or Spraying if you just don't go for the Dark Seer. But the Dark Seer is just such a good defensive layer with all the life it provides, the malediction, the blind chance, everything that it provides, and then levels, that I think it would just be, you're just better off switching to the Dark Seer here. Other than that, we do also opt for Affliction Spectres in the form of the Perfect Warlord. We have the Perfect Warlord, Guardian Turtle, Forest Warrior, and Carnage Chieftain. Now the Forest Warrior doesn't provide that much DPS, and the sole reason it is here is because this version relies on Arcanist Brand for its Virulence generation. And because it requires Arcanist Brand for its Virulence generation, having more cast speed means the brand procs more frequently, and as such you're going to be stacking Firestorm of Pelting Storms a lot more frequently. Now do keep in mind, because we are heavily leaning into Firestorm of Pelting, this variant is it's a bit weak to more mobile enemies that will jump out of the way of the Firestorm that have been stacking, and you would need to start stacking them again. This mid-budget is also the first time we are going to be introducing the Enemy Guardian into our Herald of Agony setup. Now, the reason we are able to use the Enemy Guardian in this setup is because of the life gain on minion death tech that we did for our permanent minions in the previous section. We are still employing that in the mid-budgets, but this time we have our Enemy Guardian who is going to have the following items: a Doppelganger, which gives nearby enemies increased curse effect. We have a rare helmet that just has negative chaos res for nearby enemies. This is a hunter mod. You can just get anyone that has -9. If you get one with the elevated mod, nice, but like -9 is fine. You don't have to worry about it. Doppelgangers, guys, for less physical and chaos damage taken. The regen when hit is also nice, but like I said before, we're mostly relying on the summon phantasms to keep his life topped off. But that said, Doppelganger is just a very good chess piece overall. Then for the gloves, you don't care really about the base or anything else. All you want from the gloves are curse on hits. You can go for Enfeeble, and you can also go for vulnerability. But I like Enfeeble because it just makes me feel tankier, as well as a Windscream to make it so he doesn't overwrite your curse with that curse on hits. Now, bonus points if you're able to get Chaos Res, because we actually do not have that much minion Chaos Res on the build. And as such, by being able to pick this up, you just cap his Chaos Res, because we do get some from this wheel, but that's about it. And then life regeneration rate is nice just to help with Doppelganger's regen when he does get hit. Other than that, everything else is pretty straightforward, like I said. Now for a very brief rundown on the high budget changes. We are now employing Arcanist Brand with Firestorm of Pelting to supplement our Sphaling block triggers of Ball Lightning of Orbiting and Firestorm of Pelting. The reason for this is previously we were using Ball Lightning of Orbiting paired with Spell Echo to supplement it, and going through the leveling, Arcanist Brand just feels so comfortable that there's no point in not using it. So we're using that with Firestorm of Pelting, and because it's just Firestorm, you just keep in mind that for more mobile enemies that run out, it might be less efficient to stack, but it feels a lot better than, say, Ball Lightning of Orbiting, because in tighter arenas and whatnot, Ball Lightning of Orbiting just has a tendency to hit a wall and disappear. That's kind of been my experience thus far, anyways. Aside from the Firestorm Arcanist brand setup, really not much has changed in this one. It was a very good setup, and it still is. In the examples you're seeing on screen of gameplay, I actually am not even the required level to have all the defensive points that I needed to really be as tanky as the PoB shows. But even then, I was still standing still in like T17s and Maven fights and regular boss fights and all of that. But one thing I will say is I haven't tested this on Uber bosses yet, and the reason being the Uber boss fragments were just so expensive. So I didn't bother testing on Ubers. I'm not too interested in them, so like I just didn't care. But I did try Cortex, Maven, and the non-Uber fights that were decently priced, and it performed very well on them. And now for some pros and cons on this build, in case you want to know, is this build playstyle for me or not? There are a few things that really stood out to me when I was playing, so I'll go through them real quick. Now for the pros, when you're playing very juice content, this is a very comfortable build. It has no buttons, has really good damage, has good clear because of Explode AG, has really good bossing DPS. It's very cost efficient to get DPS out of this build because all you really need is cluster jewels and virulence. Basically, it can do all content you would want it to do. Now, it's a very solid build, but there are cons. So let's try to talk a bit about the cons that we have. Now, firstly, this is a build that feels a bit awkward on less juiced content. So this is not a problem I've ever had on a previous build, but the less juice you put in your content, the less things there actually are to hit you. And on this Fallen version, at least, that means you have less virulence as you are just casually clearing. And because it's less juice content, odds are it's enough damage to clear it anyways. It just means you're going to be clearing a bit slower because now your Herald of Agony attacks slower. But this is just so long as you do not put down an Arcanist brand. The moment you put it down, your virulence is back to being high, and like that's not too much of a problem. Now, other than having like a slower map clear compared to like a build like Absolution was insane for map clear. It also has a playstyle that's not for everybody, in that it's a weird minion build where you need to stack virulence to have damage. And if let's say you're in a situation where the fight doesn't really give you as much virulence, like you're facing a very mobile enemy that just happens to be very small, and it can feel a bit awkward there. It also has a very high emphasis on standing still in juice content, and until you are tanky enough to where you can eat the damage, it can be a bit scary to know, oh, can I stand here or not? And eventually you do get the hang of knowing how much damage you can really take and when you should dodge stuff. But that is not something that you are accustomed to by default playing PoE, and it was also like a curve for me as well. Until you have enough currency under your belt, you might not get the desired playstyle you want from the build. As an example, going into the build, I made this build as a Fallen variant. I wanted less button presses. I wanted it to feel like a regular minion build, and for that I achieved my purpose. But the thing is, because I had to play the lower budget and the medium budgets to stress test it and whatnot, I had to play a large chunk of it with Arcanist brand and the playstyle that I really wasn't going for, just because that would be because of how expensive Fallen ended up being. So this is not a deal breaker for most people, but this is for me in particular. I love minion builds, and I love the less buttons it has, the better. So it's something to keep in mind, that if you're going into this on a budget, you will have to put up with like Arcanist brands and maybe manually casting some things. Maybe you're using Lance and Still or Spring. You have to do something to get your minions to actually have the damage to clear the content, basically. So if you're fine with that, it's not a downside. But for people like me who just want to no button it is a downside. Overall, even while being a slower map clearer, the build delivered a much better experience than I expected from a Herald of Agony setup, and it surprised me by just how good of a bosser it ended up being. But if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about the new setup, leave them down in the comments and I will be sure to respond. I am currently working on the strength stacking puppeteer zombie mancer, so be sure to subscribe to not miss out on that guide, which should be coming relatively soon. And with all that said, thank you for watching.